International Criminal Court at The Hague has issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. The impact of the act is sending shockwaves around the world. Former Canadian Justice Minister Irwin Cotler, a world-renowned expert and advocate for human rights who has recently survived an Iranian assassination attempt, is with the Media Line to discuss these important issues. Cotler is a critic of the International Criminal Court's campaign to charge Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with war crimes and crimes against humanity, including genocide. Minister Irwin Cotler, thank you so much for joining us at the Media Line.
Pleasure to be with you.
First and foremost, how are you and how is your family?
Well, my family and I are fine. Basically, the story that broke really reflected a situation we've been living in, for a little over a year now. In November 2023, when my wife and I were returning from Washington and we arrived at Trudeau Airport in Montreal, we were told that the RCMP, Canadian Law Enforcement Authorities, wanted to meet with us, not to leave. And they met with us, and I was told then, to use their words, that there was credible evidence of, quote, an imminent and lethal threat. And from then on, I had 24/7 protection, which included armored cars outside my house, security people accompanying me on any encounter that I was engaged in, whether I went to a medical appointment or whether I went to a family gathering. I did not make public that issue at the time that I was under that kind of threat, though people saw me always accompanied in the way I was and did feel something might be going on, but I never spoke publicly. A reporter from the Globe and Mail at the time asked me about it, had heard some information that I was under an imminent and lethal threat, and I declined to comment at the time. In fact, I did not know then what was the source of that threat. Some months later, I learned that the source of the threat was Iran. I still did not go public about it. From time to time, there were reports, but I, declined to comment until the Globe and Mail last week reported in a front page article, very well sourced, very authoritative, and it reported about the whole issue of me being under 24/7 security protection, that the threat was from the Iranian regime, etc. And then the next day, another front page story in the Canadian media, because both houses of Parliament, the House of Commons and the Senate, voted unanimously to condemn the Iranian regime's assassination threat. There was very, widespread all-party support. The interesting thing is that the motion for a unanimous vote in the House of Commons was actually moved party, which was the separatist party in the Canadian Parliament. I wasn't even moved by my own party, the Liberal Party, and in a rather divisive parliament, which we have in Canada, which reflects the situation in other democracies, in the polarized populist discourse of today, to get a unanimous resolution of both houses of Parliament is highly unusual. And I hope that sends a message, a twofold message, to the Iranian regime that their culture of impunity will not persist, that they will be held accountable, but equally to the Iranian people, that we stand in solidarity with them, because my advocacy has always been, in effect, pro-Iranian, pro the Iranian people. It has been, against the Iranian regime, which I feel is betraying its own heritage, its own values, and its own people. And I've always called upon the Iranian regime to reflect its own great civilizational values and not be engaged in the kind of transnational repression and transnational assassination that it is embarked upon, of which I'm but one example. Masih Alinejad, the great women's rights advocate based in Brooklyn, New York, she herself was under an assassination threat, and happily they apprehended those who wished to both abduct her and assassinate her. And there have been leading American officials that have been the target of such threats. John Bolton, when he was National Security Advisor, and even more recently, an alleged Iranian attempt on President-elect Trump.
Minister Cotler, you must have done something to get those Iranians angry. Let's go back to where this might have began. Why are they after you?
Well, I think my advocacy has been open, public, and sustained, particularly since the 21st century began. I recall that the 21st century began with, in January 3rd, 2000, the supreme leader of Iran saying that there can, and I'm quoting him directly, there can be no resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state. He didn't even use the euphemism of the Zionist regime. So this open and public call for genocide is a standalone violation of the Genocide Convention, where the very incitement to genocide is a crime, whether or not acts of genocide follow. And so I called then for the supreme leader to be held accountable for that standing incitement to genocide, which has continued since then. Thereafter, I was involved in a number of initiatives as a parliamentarian. One, for example, was I moved a private member's bill to hold the Iranian regime, again, accountable for what I characterized then as its sevenfold threat. In other words, its nuclear threat, its ballistic missile threat, its leading state sponsor of international terrorism threat, its hegemonic threat through Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, and the like, its basic transnational repression and assassination threat. And in particular, always, I talked about the massive domestic repression. In other words, what you had, and there's also the cybersecurity threat. What you had here is the confluence of massive domestic repression on the one hand and international aggression on the other. And the Iranian regime was the author of both. And so I sought to have legislation enacted to hold them accountable, called for as early as 2008 for the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, to be put on the terrorist list. That finally was done some 6 months ago. But, you know, my advocacy on that began in 2008. I also called for accountability of the Iranian regime for its mass murder of Iranian dissidents back in 1988. And a member of the death squad then was the former president of Iran, Raisi, who was, killed in a helicopter crash recently. But my point was that Raisi was then a case study of the culture of impunity. He was then a deputy prosecutor when he was a member of the death squad. Rather than being held accountable, he was appointed attorney general. As attorney general, he presided over the largest per capita executions, extrajudicial executions in the world. Instead of being held accountable, he was appointed to chief justice. As chief justice, he presided over also the inquiry into the downing of the airliner PS752, in which 55 Iranian Canadians were murdered. Was there any accountability? No accountability there also. So what you have here is an ongoing culture of criminality, but a culture of impunity. And I used Raisi as a case study, but it holds true, if you will, for the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and others there. We still have not held Iran accountable for the assassinations and killings in Argentina in terms of the assault there over 30 years ago in Argentina, the greatest terror incident since the end of the Second World War in Argentina. We know that Iranian senior officials were involved, like Ahmed Vahidi and the like. No one has been held accountable there. So we have here international, transnational repression and assassination, accompanied by a culture of impunity, and the same with the massive domestic repression.
A recent example is that of Rabbi Kogan in the United Arab Emirates, where the speculation is that Iran again is behind his murder. Is there anything that you can add to that you were hearing? No one is certain how that has gone down, but that's quite concerning considering the UAE has had much quiet over the past years.
Well, I've read the reports and the concern that, in fact, he had been followed for days by what were characterized as Islamic terrorists, and then were characterized as perhaps from Iran. And that's the thing about the Iranian transnational assassination, abductions, is that they outsource it. They outsource it to sometimes criminal gangs in a local area, or they outsource it to subcontracted terrorist groups. And we've seen even in Israel that some Israelis were arrested because Iran tried to engage them in terrorism in Israel. So this phenomenon is regrettably widespread, and I hope that Rabbi Kogan, the concern is, of course, that he's not only been abducted but murdered. We've not yet heard what has transpired, other than, as you mentioned, the fact that he had been followed by Islamic terrorists, may well have been both abducted and, I hope not, maybe murdered by that phenomenon of
they found the body, actually.
They found the body?
Yes.
That's that tragedy that we hoped would not occur, then has been determined as having occurred. The news has not been reported yet here in Canada. All I can say is that I hope this will serve as a wake-up call, and that Iran will be, if it is the Iranian agents that perpetrated it, that they will be held properly accountable, and that the community of democracies, and I would like to think the UAE itself, will join together in really, at this point, beginning to undertake all the necessary steps to hold Iran accountable. Right now, the only G7 countries that have put the IRGC on a terrorist list, and they're the ones behind these terrorist killings and the like, have been the US, and now followed by Canada. We need to have the other G7 countries do that. Canada is going to be hosting the G7 next meeting, and I've recommended to the Canadian government that the phenomenon of transnational repression and assassination be a priority on the G7 agenda. It's not only Iran. I mean, we're seeing this as well from China and Russia. And recently we had a foreign and still ongoing inquiry commission here into foreign electoral interference. I felt that the mandate of that commission was too narrow, because the transnational interference is not limited to election time. It includes, transnational disinformation, misinformation, cyber attacks. You as a journalist understand that well. It includes a transnational targeting of journalists, of human rights defenders, of dissidents, of leaders of diaspora communities. It includes, in particular, as I said, moving from transnational repression to transnational terrorism and assassination. This must serve as a wake-up call, as I said, for the community of democracies. It has to be a priority on our agendas. I've recommended to the Canadian government that they establish a separate department and agency to deal with the phenomenon of transnational repression and assassination. It cannot be addressed and redressed with the present resources. It needs to be prioritized on the agenda, and we need to set aside the necessary resources and manpower for that purpose.
On a personal note, you have lost some of your civil liberties, knowing that you are being targeted. What does a single day look like for you? You have security daily.
I have security 24/7. I no longer have any freedom of movement because I must be accompanied in whatever I do to any gathering, whether it be a family gathering at a restaurant or whether it be a meeting of any kind. I cannot go anywhere unescorted or unprotected. So it's made a major change in our life. I'm very appreciative, again, of the security and the exemplary protection, but the nature of, the monitoring, and I can't do anything without advising them beforehand where I want to go with proper time so that they can make the proper security check before I go somewhere. A month ago, I was to attend the 60th anniversary of my McGill Law School class as part of the overall McGill University reunion weekend. I was very much looking forward to it. It's not often that you can get together with those of your colleagues still with us from 60 years ago, having graduated together. And they checked out the premises as usual that day, and all was set to go. But then my security people got word of the fact that there was apparently evidence of an imminent and lethal assassination attempt within the next 48 hours. And of course, I could not go to my law school reunion. And that was part of the story that the excellent reporting by Robert Fife in the Globe and Mail that he broke. And he brought the whole issue of my having been under this 24/7 protection for a little over a year now to the more recent attempt clearly on my life. And that brought the whole issue of the imminence of a lethal assassination threat from Iran to the fore, because it was a very, as I said, very well-sourced, authoritative article. It was on the front page of Canada's leading national newspaper, and it attained international resonance. And so what was up to then a story that I had not discussed or commented upon but became an international one. And I've since started to comment upon it because, as I say, it's not about me personally. It has to be seen as a wake-up call to the ongoing threat of transnational repression and assassination, not only from Iran, but where the Iranian regime is the leading state actor in this malicious intent and policy.
Last we spoke, we discussed the International Criminal Court, and you were deeply concerned that it would pass and that we would find that there was going to be a warrant out for Prime Minister Netanyahu and subsequently now as well, former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Are there any chances that you feel that this can be pushed back?
I do believe that it can be pushed back. I, recommended directly to the Prime Minister and to the Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, at the time the Defense Minister. I think what I'm going to say, the Defense Minister was responsive to this, but I believe that Israel should have and still should establish an independent state commission of inquiry. I've watched the Israeli discussions on this. The last polling, not that one trusts polls, but the last polling I saw showed a dramatic support for that amongst the Israeli public. Over 70% were in favor of such an independent state commission of inquiry, only 8% against. Even a majority of those supporting the government felt that should come to pass. And that would allow the prosecutor to clearly state that Israel is undertaking its own independent investigation, and under the principle of complementarity, the ICC should not substitute its judgment for that of an independent judiciary and an independent legal process. I have taken the view that Israel always had to use the very words of the prosecutor, Karim Khan himself, a robust and independent judiciary, and that should be sufficient for purposes of combating an ICC warrant. But with regard to the ICC warrants and the nature of the prosecution, it's with respect to is there an investigation of the specific people who are being allegedly the object of such a warrant. And that's why such an independent commission of inquiry is important. I also want to say that there's enough to rebut the role of the special prosecutor in this without having to call him an anti-Semite. I think that's a mistake. I know the special prosecutor well, Karim Khan. I've mentioned this to the Prime Minister as well. I believe that he has been gone about this in a wrong way. The special prosecutor, I think he should be called out for the manner in which, for example, he has not adhered to his own principle of cooperation. In other words, at the request of the special prosecutor, Karim Khan, and with the cooperation of the Prime Minister of Israel, I helped facilitate meetings between them so that Karim Khan could undertake what he wanted to do, was to first speak with the Israeli leadership before he would institute arrest warrants. Well, on the very day that the ICC's team was supposed to come to Israel, and the special prosecutor was supposed to come to Israel for that purpose, to implement the principle of cooperation, Karim Khan, the special prosecutor, peremptorily canceled that visit, and on the same day held a press conference in which he announced that he was calling for arrest warrants against both Netanyahu and Gallant, along with Hamas leaders. To me, that was a breach of his own principle of cooperation, let alone also the principle of complementarity. And what has not been noticed in Israel, and this is where he should be held to account, is that previously he had visited with the Venezuelan dictator Maduro. And with regard to Maduro, he agreed not to institute arrest warrants with respect to the Venezuelan dictator who had dismantled any independent judiciary or any semblance of an independent legal system. But yet he called for arrest warrants against the Prime Minister and Defense Minister of a fellow democracy in breach of the principles of complementarity I mentioned, in breach of the principles of cooperation, and the application here of double standards.
This begs the question of why. Why?
I don't know why. I can't speculate. I think he, like other members of the international community, are themselves, exposed to mountains of misleading evidence and the like. For example, the allegation in the ICC warrant with regard to starvation. Now, regrettably, the allegation regarding starvation has been mainstreamed within the international NGO human rights community, has been mainstreamed within many in the international legal community, and it's clearly been demonstrated after proper inquiries to have been false. And we've had, John Spencer and others to say that there is no intentional policy of starvation. In fact, Israel has been supplying more in the way of humanitarian assistance than any other country engaged in any similar type of warfare. So that's what was so disturbing, was the evidentiary basis on which the special prosecutor relied. But as I'm saying, that unfortunately is part of what has been happening in the international community writ large. And so I think rather than call him out for being an anti-Semite, which he is not, I know him well. In fact, Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights invited him to deliver the Elie Wiesel lectureship in human rights, and he gave a very, very compelling lecture. And in no way did he, at the time, single out Israel for any kind of selective opprobrium and indictment. But I think he's been relying on the kinds of mistaken evidence that regrettably has been mainstreamed, some of which has been itself rebutted since the issuance of the arrest warrants by UN agencies themselves. So I believe that if Israel were, number one, to establish this independent commission of inquiry, that alone would put an end to the arrest warrants, because I think Karim Khan, the special prosecutor, would have no other ground upon which to continue with it. As I said, for now, he should not have called for the issuance of arrest warrant for the reasons I mentioned. But we don't have all the disclosure of the evidence yet. That's still kept secret. But we do know about the charges, and we know about the charge of starvation. That can be rebutted. And when rebutted by an independent commission of inquiry from Israel, along with the robust, independent legal system that Israel has, that would make a very compelling case for the warrants to have been withdrawn, as they should never have been instituted to begin with.
What is the likelihood of that? And then let's look at the flip side, where if Prime Minister Netanyahu or former Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant step into a country where they can get arrested, will they get arrested?
Well, the community of democracies, let's take the European Union, they have said, with the exception of Germany, which has not undertaken to arrest Netanyahu, and it's unclear about the UK, although they have said they would abide by the decision, and Canada has said the same thing. In my view, I understand why state parties to the Rome Treaty, as part of their undertaking, is to honor arrest warrants. But I think in this instance, there are sufficient grounds, both with respect to the evidence and with respect to the law, for a democracy like Canada to say that while it has been a founding member of the ICC, and I myself have been a founding supporter of the ICC. In fact, as a member of Parliament, I convened the first ever parliamentary assembly for an international criminal court back in 2002. And I am a strong supporter of the ICC. But where the ICC undertakes actions that are mistaken and ill-advised on both matters of fact and matters of law, then I think a democracy like Canada can refuse to institute the arrest warrant, particularly while appellate procedures are pending, particularly where, as I say, Israel has that independent judiciary, and where it has been willing to cooperate with the special prosecutor. So I believe that the special prosecutor should be held to account for the absence of cooperation with the Israeli leadership, according to the principle of cooperation under the ICC statute, and pursuant to which the ICC special prosecutor wants to operate. Nobody is above the law. Yes, Israeli leaders, like any leaders of any other democracy, have to be held accountable before the law, but there's a principle of equality before the law. You can't go ahead and give Venezuelan dictatorship a waiver from an arrest warrant because you said you've cooperated with them, and then call for an arrest warrant against a democracy when they have been willing to cooperate and you have not cooperated with them. So on the principle of equality before the law, let alone the fact that the Israeli leadership becomes the first leadership of any democracy to have been charged with arrest warrants.
Hold that thought, because Israel is not a member of the ICC, so they have no jurisdiction. So therefore, so that the viewer can understand, what does that mean? What kind of jeopardy is this putting them in?
You're correct. Israel is not a member state of the ICC, but the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, which I'm chair of, but even more importantly, a group of international lawyers that I was part of, which included, among others, the late Minister of Justice of France, Robert Badinter, the great UK jurist, Lord Paddington, and the like. We filed a brief with the ICC saying that they had no jurisdiction because Israel was not a state party and Palestine was not yet a state. However, following that, in my view, again in a mistaken move, Palestine was admitted as a state party to the ICC, even though it does not fulfill the obligations of a state under the Montevideo International Convention and the like. But the ICC, having made that decision, when the jurisdiction over Israel was subsequently challenged because Israel was not a state party and Palestine should not have been admitted, the ICC, in a majority judgment, did say that it had a jurisdiction with respect to what the alleged crimes that were committed, even though, as I said, we argued against it. So that argument, regrettably, has also been addressed by the ICC and found wanting. So while one can still make the argument, and the American authorities continue to make that argument, we have to bear in mind that the ICC itself has rejected that argument. But we have strong enough arguments, as I said, under the principle of complementarity, under the principle of cooperation, under the principle of equality before the law, etc., to call on both the ICC to reverse its decision, the special prosecutor to withdraw the arrest warrants. The United States has called what the ICC has done as outrageous, given as well the false moral equivalence that has been created between a democracy like Israel on the one hand and not only a terrorist organization, but a genocidal anti-Semitic terrorist organization like Hamas on the other. Not because I say so, but because Hamas itself has affirmed it in its own founding charter and since. And even after October 7th, has said that they will commit on October 7th again and again and again.
Look at the image that everyone is seeing globally right now, and I really wanted to get into this, of equating Netanyahu and Sinwar, and they're thinking that they are actually equal.
That's part of the problem, the fallout of this ICC warrants. And I said this as well to Karim Khan in my conversations with him when I objected to him when I heard that he was going to issue prospectively arrest warrants against the Israeli leadership. And I said, Karim, if you do that, the effect will be to incentivize, anti-Semitism as well. Because what we've witnessed, I said, internationally, has been a situation where one would have thought that the mass atrocities of October 7th, the unspeakable mass atrocities by not only a terrorist organization, but as I said, an anti-Semitic genocidal terrorist like Hamas, that would have resulted in a mitigation of anti-Semitism. That would have resulted in an international condemnation of anti-Semitism. On the contrary, what we've seen has been an unprecedented explosion of anti-Semitism. One has even seen, beginning October 8th, the denial even that the mass atrocity of October 7th had been committed, or support for it, or justification of it, or glorification of it, and even celebration of it. And we've seen a wholesale, moral and legal inversion since October 8th, where Israel has been the party accused of genocide, even before, while the terrorist killings were still continuing, etc. And so October 7th, with its real atrocities that were, in effect, constituents of genocide, those have been overtaken by the false allegation of genocide, which has become mainstreamed among many of the, as I said, international legal scholars, human rights organizations, and the like. And that's why I go back to why I feel what the special prosecutor did. He's not, again, I want to emphasize, he's not an anti-Semite, but his actions have resulted, however unintentionally, in the incentivization of anti-Semitism, as I've said, something that he ought well to have appreciated when that approach was taken to issue arrest warrants against both the leaders of a democracy like Israel and a genocidal terrorist organization like Hamas, put it on the same plane, create the effect, not the intent, of a false moral and legal equivalence. And that's why you see the manner in which this has metastasized in the international community. But I also go back to the one thing that Israel can do to help its own case and cause, and to make it clear, establish an independent commission of inquiry, and that will bring about, in my view, the withdrawal of the arrest warrants. And if it did not, it would make Israel's case in the court of public opinion, in the community of democracies, make it very clear that no democracy should respect any arrest warrant in that regard. Even now, it should not, for the reasons I mentioned. But such an independent commission of inquiry, strongly supported now in the Israeli public, would be the best thing, again, not only to combat the ICC, but for Israel's own internal democracy, for its own internal accountabilities, for the full truth with regard to what happened in the operational, strategic, military failures of October 7th to be brought forward. I believe that the Israeli public deserves an accounting. I believe that those who have said they would assume responsibility should do so pursuant to such an independent commission of inquiry if they have not yet done so. So this is warranted for the purposes of Israeli democracy, even leaving aside the whole question of the clear rebuttal of any ground for an arrest warrant.
Will Prime Minister Netanyahu take your call and discuss this and how you feel this should be settled?
I have conveyed that to the Prime Minister before. I've said that I believe that there should be an independent commission of inquiry. I'm just reaffirming now what I've said before and have conveyed to him. The Prime Minister believes that that should only take place at the end of the war. I believe, in the light of all the international developments as the war is being undertaken and continuing in the manner in which it is, and more particularly, given the compelling demand within the Israeli public on an issue that has been very divisive within issue, the whole question of responsibility and accountability for October 7th, etc. I believe that such an independent commission of inquiry is more than warranted. And certainly we don't need what is being talked about, which is a return to the attempt by the justice minister to engage again in the undermining of the independence of the judiciary in Israel and the like. So both those things should be addressed. We don't have to go back to what was going on for the year before October 7th, which may have facilitated the Iranians and others feeling now is the time to attack, because Israel is being polarized and weakened and etc. from within. We don't need another repeat of that. And what we do need is an independent commission of inquiry to put to rest, what happened, to let the truth finally be told, to let accountability rest where it warrants to be rest, and to, as I say, at the same time, combat any putative allegations coming from the special prosecutor or the ICC.
Looking at President Biden and looking at President Trump, President Biden is claiming that he is working with Prime Minister Netanyahu to try to work this out. President Trump has stated that he might seek sanctions directly against Karim Khan. What are your thoughts on where the United States' role should be at the moment? Would sanctions on Karim Khan be effective? Is it the way to go?
Well, I'm pleased that you have both Republicans and Democrats united in critiquing the decisions of the ICC and that of the special prosecutor in seeking arrest warrants to begin with. However, I'm not in favor of sanctioning the ICC. I am in favor of unmasking the manner in which they have proceeded and the manner in which Karim Khan has proceeded in breach of the own foundational principle of the ICC, as I've mentioned. I prefer that route. I prefer the route of calling out the decisions as being outrageous, which they are, but not of imposing sanctions.
Do you find it odd that your Prime Minister, Trudeau, would not allow Bibi to enter Canada? He could be arrested?
He didn't say he would be arrested. I think what he was saying, and people have inferred from that, he said that Canada, as a founding member of the court, will honor regulations and decisions of the court. He didn't specifically say, though it was a clear inference, that Canada would honor an arrest warrant. But for the reasons I mentioned, because we are a founding party to the ICC, I believe that we can independently say why we would not honor an arrest warrant for all the reasons I mentioned. And I hope to convey that personally to the Canadian Prime Minister. I've made my position public. I hope to be meeting with him shortly and to convey that personally to him. There are also a whole set of legal procedures that involved our own extradition act and the like. It's not something that is that simple. And so I think it's more complicated than it appears. In my view, there would be justification for the Prime Minister not to issue an arrest warrant with regard to comply with an arrest warrant for the reasons I mentioned, and even in accordance with Canadian domestic law, the Extradition Act and the like.
Former Israeli cabinet minister Ayelet Shaked was banned from entering into Australia for a security conference. You see a domino effect here.
I thought that was shocking. To refuse entry to a former justice minister of a fellow democracy, that was a shameful act by the Australian government. I cannot comprehend that unless, they have gotten caught up in, the mainstream of what is basically a culture of delegitimization and singling out of a fellow democracy, as I said, for selective opprobrium and indictment, and thereby punishing the leaders of that democracy without any basis whatsoever. So I would hope that the Australian government would realize that they have acted absolutely contrary to what a democracy should do. And I would hope that no other democracy would operate in the same. We're not even talking about somebody who was under any plausibility of any arrest warrant. We're talking about a former, Minister of Justice of Israel, of a fellow democracy. Shocking. That's the only way I can characterize what the Australian government did.
Very tough times, very tough issues. Kind of want to leave everyone on a lighter note if we can. Is there something you miss, and this is not light per se, but something that you miss doing alone without having 24/7 police protection?
Well, I've just missed, the freedom that my family could have to live a normal life with freedom of movement. I appreciate the exemplary protection, but I would love to be able to go back to the normal movement of any citizen in any democracy, which is, freedom of movement to begin with. So I would hope, but I have to say I'm very encouraged by the strong support of both houses of the Canadian Parliament, very encouraged by the strong support from the Canadian public and human rights community, and I might add the very, very strong support that I've gotten from the Iranian people themselves. Iranian press has been after me now for some years, and so they have been seeking to go after me in the Iranian-controlled media, but the Iranian people have expressed support. And one hopeful note, I'm a strong believer in what Martin Luther King said. I do believe that at the end of the day, the arc of history will bend towards justice, and that is our own Jewish tradition and values as well. So, Tov, it will be good, as I said, and we will, in the end, justice will prevail.
Minister Irwin Cotler, thank you so much. Wishing you safety and strength at this very difficult time. Thank you for joining me at the Media Line.
Thank you, Felice, for your informed questions, sometimes my long answers, but I very much appreciate our exchange.
Thanking you, the viewer, for joining us at the Media Line. Please be in touch with comments at editor@themedialine.org and follow us on social media handles.